let's have a word about English language Bible translations. It's January 1st. It's probably the most anticipated January 1st of my lifetime. And with January 1st usually comes new aspirational goals for reading the Bible. So in some of the questions and comments and discussions, I noticed people asking about different Bible translations and for recommendations of Bible translations. So in this video, I want to give you an overview of different Bible translations that we have and what makes them different. B, hopefully help you determine if you're looking for a new Bible translation or which ones are going to meet the needs for what you're looking for. And C, give you a few recommendations that might fit in those categories. All right, so if I'm looking for to recommend a Bible, there are usually two things that I'm looking for. The first thing that I like to see in a translation that I'm going to recommend is that it's translated by a committee of translators. So not one individual person. Even if that individual person is a really good scholar, I think it's best practice to have multiple people looking at a text and coming to consensus, and that keeps some individual person from sort of having the possibility of going off the rails and coming up with some kind of crazy interpretation that doesn't really fit what's going on in the passage. So that's number one. Number two, and more controversial, some people will disagree with this, but I think it's good to get a translation that uses the best original text that we can look at. So this would cut out the King James Version and the New King James Version. Now, the New King James Version follows the original text that was used for the King James Version, which is the Textus Receptus, which was text criticism that was done during the time of the Reformation by a guy named Erasmus. I can make another video on that at another time if you're interested. But basically, since that time, since the time of the Reformation, we have found many, many more old manuscripts and fragments that we can look at and piece together what we think the original document was with a little bit more precision than Erasmus could do when he was visiting libraries in France back at the time of the Reformation. So those aren't bad translations, and God has certainly used those in amazing ways throughout the history of the English-speaking church. But I think today, if I was picking a translation, I would pick something that makes use of the best source text available. So what are the differences between all these different translations that you see on the bookshelf at your Christian bookstore, if those exist anymore, or your Barnes & Noble or on Amazon or whatever? The difference usually comes down to translation philosophy. So what do I mean by translation philosophy? So on one side of the continuum, you have what's called a formal equivalence model. A lot of times people will refer to this as a word-for-word translation, and that kind of gets at what they're doing, in that basically they are trying to make the English translation of the text as close as possible to the words used in the original language text. Now on the other side, you have what's called a dynamic equivalence model. Sometimes it's called a functional equivalence model, but they're not so concerned with the actual words used being represented. They're more concerned with what idea or truth that the text was trying to convey. Now, by nature of a dynamic or a functional equivalent model, that means the translator is going to have to make interpretive decisions for you more often. It's going to be easier to read though. If you go to the more formal equivalent side, then you're going to get some clunky wording, and sometimes the translation is going to seem like something that it's actually not. So let me give you an example from the Old Testament. So there's this phrase that God uses in speaking of himself. He says, "I am long of nose." What does that mean, that God is long of nose? So as an English reader, if you look at that, what are the ways that you interpret that? All right, you may look at that and say, God's got a long nose. He's putting his nose in people's business, or he's nosy. He knows what's going on. You may relate it to like people get a long nose if they're not telling the truth, if they're being deceptive. But you probably, from an English understanding, without looking at any context, you are probably not going to land on what is really meant by that phrase, which is, I have a long fuse. So there's an idiom in Hebrew that your nose burns hot, like you're hot when you're angry. And so God has a long nose, so when his nose burns hot, he is it's almost in every translation translated something like long suffering. So if you say long of nose, on this side, you translate it long suffering. Well, are you really doing the English equivalent word? No, of course, you're doing some kind of dynamic equivalent in your translation. So all that is to say, one side isn't evil and the other side virtuous, or vice versa, because every translation is doing this to some extent. And in reality, many of the scholars that serve on the translation committee of one version are serving on the translation committee of another version. So it just comes down to what you're looking for. So what do I recommend? I recommend, if someone has a hard time reading the Bible, if they're a new believer maybe, or they're just trying to start the discipline of Bible reading, then you might want to look more toward a dynamic or functional equivalent model. So that might be something like the New Living Translation. So that's a very good translation done by good scholarship, but it is definitely more on the functional dynamic equivalent side. If you're going to be teaching the Bible to others, if you're going to be doing in-depth word studies, if you're going to do expositional study, teaching, anything like that, you probably want to be more on the formal equivalent side. You want to look at the actual words. And then, probably for most people, a good translation is a translation that tries to sort of meet in the middle. It tries to sort of smooth it out when it needs to be smoothed out, but tries to stay as connected to the text as possible when it can. And that's going to be your stuff like the New International Version or the Holman Christian Standard, which I think is now called the Christian Standard Bible, CSB. So one of those that are kind of in the middle, that would probably be the bread and butter for most people. And for me, I tend to lean more on the formal equivalent side. I read the ESV most of the time. I'll look at the New American Standard. If I really want to see more like how did they interpret it. But if I'm going to be chugging through huge passages of narrative text or something like that, I might pull a New Living Translation or something like that. And I'll often look at how did the NIV or the Christian Standard Bible render something. So I think there's a place for all of them. It just depends on what you're looking for. But there are no perfect translations. There's only the best for you in your situation.